Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Money Matters podcast, the show where we discuss important financial topics that were never covered in med school. I'm your host, Dr. Tsang Patel. Welcome back to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. It's been a while since we talked about disability insurance. I think my very first show was about what doctors and residents and medical students needed to know about disability insurance. And I thought it was time to do an update. But I also wanted to add some of the questions that we have when it's time to actually use the disability insurance. So my guests today are Stephanie Tsang, who is a disability insurance broker in Scottsdale, Arizona, and Ed Comitz, who is a attorney also here in Arizona, who deals with filing disability or lawsuits against the disability insurance companies. And I thought they would be a good combination to have, and you'll see through the show, we'll be discussing some of the questions and they'll both chime in with their perspective. But I thought they would be good to bring on together to answer some of these questions. We talk, in this episode, we talk about some of the basic information physicians need regarding disability insurance, and we clear up some of the misconceptions that we may have. We talk about individual policies, association policies, employer policies, which ones are generally better for you, the physician, and maybe in which order you should get them if multiple ones are available to you. The definite pros and cons to the various types. We talk about what's double dipping in terms of disability benefits, which companies are more favorable to physicians, why it matters what state you're from or where you actually acquire the disability insurance when you actually get it. We talk a little bit about what happens if you want to change the policies. We talk about if there's a cap on the amount of insurance you can get. And probably most importantly, many of you may already have disability insurance, but we talk about what you should know before you file a claim and what happens when you do file the claim. We talk about when you should consult an attorney. And really, spoiler alert, the answer is before you file for disability. And finally, we discuss a little bit about when you can actually drop your disability insurance. So take a listen. I'm going to split this episode into two parts, but both parts are really equally beneficial and build upon each other. So this is part one. Okay, welcome to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. My guests today, I have two guests. Edward Comitz, an attorney in Scottsdale with the healthcare and disability insurance practice of Comitz and Beath. Ed, am I saying that right, Comitz?
It's Comitz Beathy.
Comitz Beathy. Okay, thank you. And my other guest today is Stephanie Tsang, a partner and comprehensive financial advisor at North Star Resource Group, also in Arizona. Ed and Stephanie kind of work with each other in regards to the disability insurance space. And so we're going to talk a little bit about updates in disability insurance, and then Ed's also going to talk to us about disability insurance and the legal sides of it when you actually file for disability, if the insurance companies disallow it, what kind of issues you have if you have to file a claim, things like that. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Ed and Stephanie.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's just start a little bit quickly with Stephanie here. So Stephanie, we've talked on this episode, on this podcast before with a disability insurance person about the basics of disability, but I'd kind of like to, just get your perspective. So what is disability insurance and what does the average physician need to know about disability insurance?
Absolutely. So to bring it back to the basics, when we talk about what disability insurance is, it's going to be an insurance that has a monthly benefit amount that is going to be used to replace your income in case of a disability. So if you can't work in your profession, you want to make sure that you have income coming in to be able to pay your bills or anything else that you need, medical expenses. I would say, when we talk about the different types, there's really short-term disability insurance and long-term disability insurance. And I think that's important to have that differentiation because people just assume there's one type. But short-term disability insurance, it's really from usually 0 to 90 days or 3 months 3 to 6 months, I would say. And then long-term disability is something that typically kicks in. There's usually a waiting period of 3 months. It kicks in on the 91st day, and it lasts till age 65, 67. So as an advisor, when we're looking at the two different types, a lot of times we want to self-insure for the short-term disability insurance. We want to make sure, hey, if we have enough cash to be able to, pay for our bills for the next 3 months, we want to make sure we self-insure for that. Anytime, because I think people sell insurance, they want to sell insurance for everything. And I think that makes it very difficult, because the whole point is you want to have insurance when there's going to be a catastrophic reason for it. So if you can't work until age 67, that's when we need to outsource those types of things to an insurance company to make sure that you're going to be able to pay your bills long term. So that's the big difference between kind of short term and long term. And I think there's also different subsets that Ed was going to kind of jump into as well that I think are really important to know about.
Sure. There are really two types of insurance that people think about. There's individual insurance, and then there's employer-sponsored insurance. So any insurance that you receive through an employer-sponsored employee benefit plan. But they're very different. Stephanie sells individual insurance, and that, as the name suggests, is purchased by individuals directly from an insurance carrier like Berkshire or MetLife or MassMutual. The benefits of an individual policy over an employer-sponsored plan is that the individual policies are governed by state law rather than a federal statute called ERISA. And Arizona and California and some other states have some of the most favorable insurance laws in the country as far as protecting the insured is concerned. So that's something that's very important. As Stephanie said, individual policies provide a set monthly benefit amount. So if you buy $10,000 worth of insurance a month or $15,000 a month of insurance, you're going to know at the end of the day when you're filing your claim exactly how much insurance you're going to get. The individual policies also tend to have the best definitions of total disability. They tend to have better definitions of what your occupation is. So if you're, let's say, a specialist like a surgeon, you can buy a specialty rider to your own occupation policy. So as far as policies are concerned, our firm generally only represents people on individual policies. The other type of policies are called employer-sponsored plans, and these are the least expensive. And people think as doctors, I have insurance through my employer, why would I buy individual insurance? Employer-sponsored plans provide disability insurance not in a set amount, but based on a percentage of what your prior base salary was. And they reduce that benefit amount if you receive income from other sources, which people don't really understand. So if you receive Social Security disability benefits, or you have another private insurance policy, or you're earning money, those can all offset the amount of insurance that you receive under your group policy. The group policies also have standard exclusions and limitations for conditions like mental health conditions or mental nervous conditions or conditions that aren't objectively verifiable. So if you have a family history of things like depression, anxiety, you have a substance abuse problem, or think that could be an issue in the future, you're suffering from a pain disorder or Lyme disease, the employer-sponsored plans aren't really going to help you as much. The kicker on the employer-sponsored plans is that they're governed by a federal statute called ERISA. And ERISA was supposed to be for the protection of employees. It was a federal statute that was supposed to expedite the claims process for employees, but it was unfortunately actually sponsored by and endorsed by the insurance industry. And it gives you a lot less leverage to ensure that your benefits are properly paid than state laws. With ERISA, if your claim's denied, you have to go through an appeal with the insurance company before going to court, and that's the insurance company that just denied your claim. You don't have a right to a jury trial. You have to file a claim in federal court. You don't get to testify. A federal judge is going to consider only the information that you've presented on your appeal to the insurance company and only overturn that decision if it was arbitrary and capricious. So essentially, you as the insured under an ERISA policy or under an employer-sponsored plan have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, kind of like the criminal standard, that you're entitled to benefits. And if there's any doubt in favor of the insurance company, then the insurance company wins. The only thing that you can get in ERISA if you file a lawsuit is your past due benefits, interest, and a discretionary award of attorney's fees. Whereas if you compare that with an individual policy, you don't have to go through an appeal process. You can immediately file in court. You get a jury trial. You can get your back benefits plus interest, attorney's fees, and if the insurance company acted unreasonably, you can also get your future benefits in a lump sum, emotional distress damages, and possibly punitive damages. So as you can see, there are huge differences. My firm really only accepts the individual policies for representation because the employer-sponsored plans, for the most part, aren't really worth the paper that they're written on unless you have really a catastrophic injury.
Okay, so let's go into this a little bit more, because I think many of my listeners and most physicians now, a large number of them are employed rather than, solo practitioners or small practices. And so, many of them, while I would definitely encourage them to get an individual policy, are covered, either with an individual policy or both, individual and an employer-sponsor policy. So can you have both? And if so, what are the limitations with that?
Well, you can have both. I think one of the biggest limitations is that your employer-sponsored plan might have an offset for your individual plan. So your employer-sponsored plan could completely offset your individual plan, so you essentially only have your individual plan. The other things that I mentioned, which I think are critical, is that the employer-sponsored plans only cover certain types of disabilities, and they have limitations, let's say, for like a mental health condition where they only provide coverage for 2 years or 5 years. The policies are much more robust. If you look at an individual policy, the policy might be 10 or 15 pages long. The employer-sponsored plans tend to be like, 50, 60 pages long. And where you give with one hand, you're taking away with another. And people don't realize that. And when they come to us, they're like, wow, I was in a catastrophic injury and I'm receiving Social Security disability benefits. That's offsetting the amount that I'm getting under my, $10,000 a month plan that I have through my employer. Oh, it says I'm supposed to get $10,000 a month, but they're looking at my prior earnings in the last 2 years because I have a slowly progressive condition. I actually made less money. So I don't get $10,000. I get $6,000. And then you're going to subtract Social Security. And then, I just realized now under the individual policies, if I pay with after-tax dollars, my benefits aren't going to be taxed. But under the employer-sponsored plan, my benefits are going to be taxed.
Okay, so this is a distinction I think a lot of people are maybe misinformed about, and myself included, because I was under the impression that on the individual side, there's a certain amount that's max. Many physicians, especially those in high-paying fields, try to get as high of an amount as they can within reason for cost purposes on the individual side, and then they supplement with what is covered by the employer. So what you're saying, yeah, go ahead, Stephanie.
Well, and let me add to that, from when you're on the purchasing side, one thing that you have to know, especially, there's kind of two ways to look at it, because a lot of our clients are still in training. So whether they're residents, fellows, the nice thing about that and why we recommend getting disability at that point is because they technically don't count your group insurance as part of your income. Because if you think about it from an insurance point of view, they're never going to want to make you whole. They never want you to have enough disability coverage. So they're probably only looking at it between, 80, 85%. So when you're still in training, they don't count anything. So you can truly get the max that you can get as a resident or fellow of $5,000 per month, tax-free. If you're working, so you're a physician that's been working, you have group, the coverage is 60% of your income. Unfortunately, if you go out to get an individual policy, they're going to take into consideration your group coverage of 60% and only offer you or allow you to get a monthly benefit that's going to get you up to that 80, 85%, depending on the company. So it's also from a purchasing standpoint, you have to be very careful of trying to get as much on the individual side, because as Ed had just mentioned, unfortunately, a lot of the group coverage isn't worth the paper it's written on. So if you think about it, even though it says 60%, unfortunately, if you don't follow all this criteria, that's not going to count. And now you truly only have about 20 to 25% of true individual coverage that's going to pay out at time of disability.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is you want to get the individual coverage first, and then if you can. Right.
If you can,
right.
Absolutely. But if you're already working, at a hospital, it's already covered. Just know that unfortunately, you're not going to be able to get as much as you can, what you probably want, because they're only going to get you up to that 80, 85%.
That's right. And if you're in a group practice, let's say you're in a large anesthesiology group and you're buying a group policy for, all of the partners, one of the things you want to look at is whether or not there is an offset provision within your group policy. And if there isn't, that's obviously a much better policy than one that does provide for the offset. So they do sell the policies that don't have the offset. And so that's something you should look for as as your office administrator or as a partner in a large practice.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually a pretty critical point, because I don't think, again, most people are looking at cost considerations, things like that. But in this setting, if you have the access and making the choice, many of us working for larger health institutions don't have that. But for, practices where your physicians are in charge of making these decisions, absolutely do that. So let's get into a little bit further. So we talked a bit about the short-term disability and then the long-term disability, individual policy, and then, the group or hospital policies. One of the other types that people have access to and have questions are, like, for example, the American Medical Association or your specialty organizations will offer policies that are not specifically tied to your employer, but they're not the individual policies. What are your experience with that?
I can address that. The group policies are kind of a hybrid. They're almost as good as the individual policies, but not as good as the but much better than the employer-sponsored plans. The thing is, when you have a policy through a group, you are not in what's called legally privity of contract with your insurance company. The contract is between, let's say, the American Medical Association and whoever their insurance company is, and you as a physician are a third-party beneficiary under that contract. What that means is the American Medical Association can, hear comments from its membership and decide, our members think the premiums are too high. They want to, reduce the premiums. That's our number one complaint. And then the American Medical Association and its insurer can modify the terms of your coverage. You'll receive a notice in the mail that says, okay, we're changing the definition of total disability, or we're adding a more robust provision relating to the type of care that you have to have. And you'll get that in the mail. You'll either toss it or you'll read it and not understand it contextually. And so what happens with these group policies is you can end up with coverage that's different than the coverage that was originally marketed to you. So that's an issue. I know the American Dental Association, for example, they have a contract with a company called Great West, and there's a requirement in that policy that you have to be actively working full time in order to qualify for benefits. I'm not sure if the American Medical Association has a similar requirement. For people who have slowly progressive conditions, they may start reducing their number of hours and start working from 5 days a week, let's say, to 2 days a week, and not understand that now they're working under 30 or 35 hours a week, and therefore their insurance is still not viable. So there are benefits to the individual policy because you know exactly what you're going to get at the end. You know the dollar amount, you know the definitions, and they're much less complex policies. They're easier for the layperson to read and understand. The group policies tend to be much longer and more nuanced. And again, it's easier to see if you read them through, if you actually take the time to read them through, that they are where they're giving with one hand, they're taking away with another. And oftentimes the group policies will have offsets. They'll have limitations and exclusions relating to mental health conditions and conditions that aren't so objectively verifiable, just like the employer-sponsored plans. So takeaway is the best types of policies typically are the individual private policies.
Okay. Right. Okay. So that's good. So we're going to focus, ideally, if you can, individual policy. Next, a lot further down the line would be the group or the association, AMA, et cetera. And then last would be the employer policy. Okay. So let's talk about how much disability insurance does a practicing physician need. So obviously it varies on income, specialty, things like that. But let's give a couple of scenarios. So let's say you're a recently out of training primary care, physician in one of the lower physician paying specialties. Your annual income is, let's say, $200,000. You've got student loans, you practice expenses, things like that, but you didn't get the good advice to get your disability insurance right out or during residency. Stephanie, what would you tell that person?
Well, again,
let's give that person, let's say, because I know there's some gender cost concerns too. So let's say this is a recently graduated woman coming out of residency.
Well, and unfortunately, again, being a woman, it's hard to say this, but unfortunately, we're a lot more expensive because of certain things. We're usually about, I would say, 30 to 40% more expensive than male. So just know, again, for that person specifically, we'll talk about it in a sec, but just know there's also, when you're still in training, gender neutral rates that you can qualify for so that we can actually be looked at as kind of a gender neutral. So it's usually 30% less expensive prior if you can get it during training. But to kind of go back to what you were saying, unfortunately, if you have something through work already, then again, as I mentioned before, you're kind of capped on what you can get from the individual side. But for example, if you were to be able to kind of get as much as you wanted or that was offered, there's really two ways that people kind of look at disability insurance. And, it is a cost perspective, number one, but it's usually replacing monthly expenses. So you kind of going through your budget, you add up all those expenses. So you have to think about it. Okay, if I can't work, I'm bringing in no income. How can I cover these expenses, which has to include student loans and a lot of the other debts that you're continuing to pay for. So you have to take kind of an expense of that. And a lot of times that's what people will get because, again, they want to try to get the least expensive as possible when it comes from a cost. On the flip side, though, of course, what we would always recommend is try to replace more so of your income. Because if you think about it, if it's a long-term disability insurance, and unfortunately it happens earlier on your career, so you have potentially 20, 30 years of this disability insurance that's going to be coming in, we want to make sure that you can also still fund like your investments, fund your retirement so that you're not going to be put in a bad position. Maybe not you can pay your bills, but what are you going to do when the disability insurance is gone? So we like to recommend, obviously, the monthly income, but I will say the majority of people look at it from a cost perspective, of course. And a lot of times we say at least replace your monthly expenses and even maybe a little bit on top of that, just in case there's some additional medical expenses from that disability insurance that are going to be added on to that.
Okay. And then one of the other things with disability insurance.
Can I add on to that for a second? I think this is important. I mean, when people think of disability insurance, when doctors think of disability insurance, they think of something catastrophic happening to them. They're in an accident, they become quadriplegic, they're in a coma, something like that. Well, doctors actually have a much higher prevalence of filing claims under their own occupation policies than any other group. And that's because of patient safety issues. So if you have an essential tremor and you're a surgeon, you probably can't do surgery. If you have cervical radiculopathy, it's probably not beneficial for you to work as an ophthalmologist or surgical ophthalmologist. So there are all of these disabilities that we don't really consider when we're buying the policies. We're thinking of something that's catastrophic that's going to happen when really just the slightest thing can make it very difficult, if not impossible, for a physician to work. If you're having memory problems, if you're distracted by pain, these can all affect your ability to practice safely and efficiently. So when you're thinking about the type of policy that you want to buy and how much coverage you want, my clients always come to me and they say, I wish I bought more coverage. I didn't realize that I was going to have a slowly degenerative neck condition or back condition that was going to put me out of work early, or I was going to have degenerative condition of the eyes that makes it difficult for me to see, and therefore I'm not able to work the way I was supposed to. So when you're looking at disability insurance, I know it's expensive, but it's really a fraction of what you actually make, what you actually earn. I think that it probably will turn out to be, 1% to 2% of what you're actually earning. But it's money that's well invested because right now, I've been doing this for 25 years, helping physicians and dentists collect on their private disability insurance policies. And when I started years ago, there was only one type of policy that was sold, which was called a true own occupation policy. That policy said that if you are unable to do the substantial material duties of your own occupation, then you're able to collect total disability benefits. And if you can work in another occupation, you have the ability to double dip. So you can earn money in another occupation, collect that, and collect your total disability benefits under your private policy. Unfortunately, now there aren't really standard own occupation policies, and I think there's an absence of appropriate regulation in this area because the insurance commissioners are allowing insurance companies to sell true own occupation policies that aren't true own occupation policies. The double dip feature is critical, and now a lot of the policies will have what I call no work provisions. So you're totally disabled if you're unable to work in your own occupation and you're not actually working in another occupation. If you do work in another occupation, you don't qualify for coverage. So if you take an expense approach and you, like Stephanie was saying, and you get, let's say, $7,000 or $10,000 in benefits a month, and you're not able to work, well, that's not going to carry you over the rest of your life. So people in that situation have to decide, am I going to collect disability benefits or am I going to try and find another high-paying job? Some of the policies shift from an own occupation definition to an any occupation definition after a period of years. So you might think that you're getting own occupation coverage, but then you realize that after the 5-year period, it switches to any occupation. So while it originally protects you from being disabled, if let's say you're a surgeon, later on it protects you if you're disabled from, say, being a toll booth operator. So, like I said, early on, all the policies were the same. The individual policies, now we're seeing that many of them are having offset provisions as well. So the most important thing for you to do when you're talking to someone like Stephanie, who understands the nuances of disability insurance and what the products are, is you have to get the true own occupation policy that allows you to double dip, and you should get as much coverage as you can afford, because if something happens, you're going to need that coverage. And you have to watch out for things like the no work provisions, the policies that shift from own occupation to any occupation. There are now even policies that say that you have to work. Like they'll say you're totally disabled if you're unable to perform your own occupation, and you must be working in another occupation. So, and we see that as a problem sometimes with lifetime benefits. People think they have lifetime benefits, but, at age 65, they decide that they can't work in another occupation anymore. It's not really feasible for them, and therefore their lifetime benefits are downgraded to benefits to, let's say, age 65. So it's important that you talk to someone like really an experienced, sophisticated advisor who can tell you really accurately what the differences are between these policies, because the companies aren't really training the agents who are selling the policies on what these different nuances are, and they're all selling the policies as, oh, this one's cheaper than that one, and it's just called a different name. But when it comes down to it, you need to make sure that you have the double dip provision on the own occupation policy and you have the highest benefit amount, and you'll thank me later on for getting it.
I want to thank Ed and Stephanie for appearing on the podcast. I hope you found that part informative, and I encourage you to listen to part 2 for even more information about the topics we discussed, and particularly relating to what happens when you do file for disability insurance. God forbid you need it. Ed and Stephanie's contact information will be on the show notes, and if you have any further questions, please post them on the Facebook group or email me directly at comments@drmoneymatters.com. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Dr. Money Matters. If this is the first episode you have heard, I appreciate you taking the time out and listening, and encourage you to listen to our past episodes. I would also appreciate you leaving me a positive review on Apple Podcasts, and also recommend you join our Facebook group, where we have ongoing discussions about this and other topics in order to help each other reach our financial goals. Finally, I encourage you to subscribe to our email list, and also to subscribe to the podcast itself on the various podcast app that you use in order to be kept aware when the latest episode comes out. More episodes of this podcast are available at www.drmoneymatters.com and on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Audio versions are also available on YouTube and Facebook, and you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Money Matters, or on Facebook or Instagram at Dr. Money Matters, all spelled out. Thanks for listening, and if you get a chance, please leave a positive review for this podcast, as it helps move the podcast up the rankings on iTunes and gets it exposed to a wider audience. Thanks for listening once again, and stay tuned for another episode coming soon.